bienvenidas a la última sesión de la conferencia. Welcome everyone to the final session of the conference. So it's my great pleasure to be chairing this session, and hopefully there are lots of questions. We are planning for a long discussion, hopefully. And I'm going to be introducing our two speakers. So first of all, we have Mona Fawaz. She's going to be talking about inhabiting Beirut's ruins, which is great to hear from another place a bit far from here. A good reminder of different patterns, practices, and knowledges happening in different parts of the world. So Mona Fawaz is a professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut, where she has co-founded the Beirut Urban Lab, a regional research center invested in working towards more inclusive, just, and viable cities. Mona's research stems from the imperative of making cities more just, addressing urbanization through the lenses of informality and the law, land, housing, property, and space, always responding to the urge of informing planning theory and practice. Her findings are published in scholarly articles, book sections, and reports, and she has held several international fellowships. She currently serves as part of the editorial collective for the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and on the board of Journal Planning Theory and City and Society. So Mona is honorary professor at the Department of Planning in the Bartlett at UCL. This is the last part. And she has taught as a visiting professor in other universities, Paris and Basel. Thank you very much, Mona. And we will also have some words from Catalina Ortiz. So Catalina is a Colombian urbanist, an educator who is passionate about spatial justice. She's an associate professor at the Development Planning Unit at UCL, and she serves as the director of the UCL Urban Lab. And her work spans over 2 decades, mostly in Latin America. She's very much aware of the collective work required to shift the field of studies, and urban studies in particular. And this is why she's part of several teams, editorial teams in journals and books in different countries, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and the US. So thank you very much, Catalina and Mona.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, actually, and thank you for coming. Before I speak, I really want to thank colleagues in RC21, the organizing committee, who have invited me and given me the opportunity to speak to colleagues whose work has inspired me for a very long time. I'm really happy to be there. Thank you for the warm welcome, also to colleagues in the university here, and to IJER, of course, etc. I also want to acknowledge before I start speaking that I am coming from a region where a genocide is unfolding. And over the last few days, I noticed that some of you are wearing your kafiyas. I'm also wearing the tatris that is done by Palestinian women in refugee camps. So it is very difficult for those of us who are living in the middle of that to be able to think about other issues. And yet there are many crises. We, of course, are also in a context where multiple genocides have historically happened, and where the institutions, the academic institutions, are not strangers to these processes. I don't know enough about it. I apologize, but I recognize that there's a history that is parallel and rife with injustices that needs to be acknowledged. I also want to say I'm super excited to be talking in Chile, because in 2019, when we were protesting in Beirut on the streets and we believed that a better world was possible, and over 1 million of us, 1 in 4 Lebanese, was camping on the streets for weeks on end. Chile was doing the same thing, and we were watching you from far and learning a lot from the practices of the dances and the banging on the pots. And maybe your dreams and ours are deferred, but it will happen. Finally, I want to thank all those of you who came and are willing to squeeze your legs. You came the first day not knowing. Today you know, and still you came, so I feel very special. Thank you. I'm going to start my presentation. So the work I'm presenting today is work that I have been conducting from the Beirut Urban Lab, where I work and teach at the American University there. I work with a team of fantastic young researchers. And with them, we face a lot of issues. And our work very much starts from the premise that this work needs to explain and help change the world in which we live. It's not operational, you will see, but at the same time, it is trying very much to engage with that context. And the work I'm presenting is very much their labor and mine. I'm going to start with, this is the picture of the Urban Lab and some of the researchers. And you can learn more about it on our website. And this is Beirut. I don't take things for granted. You can see it's very far, and it's important to recognize that it's a very different context. So I want to start by painting one vignette of the city, just so that we know we're talking about the same things. Very often you present in places that are different, and you're not really clear. I think pictures help in that context. So this large modern building was originally intended to be a furnished apartment complex, housing short-term business visitors and tourists coming to the Beirut of the 1960s. Despite severe dilapidation, I think you can still distinguish some of its modern architectural features that were once part of the neighborhood's booming real estate activities. 60 years later, things have obviously changed. The building stands like a makeshift camp or a tenement. When we surveyed the residents in July 2022, it housed about 160 men, women, and children, all of them Syrian refugees who had been in Lebanon for varying periods. They occupied 36 apartments distributed on the first 6 floors of the building. The remaining 7 floors are unused because they were hit during the Civil War and also because they're inaccessible. On the facade, you can see balconies without balustrades. Behind them, doors have lost often their glass panes, allowing wind and rain to penetrate freely the apartments. Many residents have made makeshift curtains from swaths of nylon, cloth, or cardboard to provide some privacy. In addition, hanging laundry and stacked mattresses convey the feeling of an overcrowded living flowing out of the confined spaces. Decay extends, of course, well beyond the building facades. Right from the entrance, one notices exposed electric wires and evident water leakages along the walls, doubled with the stink of old moisture. Mold grows uncontrollably on the ceilings and walls of most floors, apartments, and common hallways. It really stinks. Consequently, many residents, adults and children, suffer from asthma and other respiratory diseases. In its original design, the building had included 2 types of layout. So there were the small apartments and the larger apartments. But since then, they've been re-subdivided in makeshift ways in order to accommodate more people, a full family in one apartment. And they've added ad hoc kitchens and bathrooms. And of course, all of this has ruined a lot the waterproofing. Now, you would think this is located in a forgotten neighborhood or somewhere where people usually study these kinds of developments in an informal settlement. But the building is in Hamra, which is the backyard of the American University of Beirut. And I kind of wanted to show this picture of the Hamra of the 60s, when it was the beating heart of Beirut's commercial and financial activities. And during that period, Beirut received about 30% of the global gold trade. It was a city that had really a central role in the exchanges between Europe, the West, and the Arab Gulf. Today, the neighborhood fabric doesn't look like this anymore at all. It comes across like an incoherent patchwork, constantly remade without a semblance of concerted planning or coordination, or a vision of trajectory of where it may be heading. There are at least 10 buildings in the area that display similar characteristics to the residential pattern and residential patterns to the one I described. 1 in 5 buildings in the neighborhood is either fully or partially vacant. A decade ago, city planners were still drawing plans for how a bright, unified future can happen for Beirut, but the effects of the concerted crisis have made us abandon all hopes of such a thing. So, of course, there is the regional violence. I pointed to the war in South Lebanon and in Gaza, but there's also what is called the refugee crisis, the war in Syria, and the fact that today 1 in 4 persons in Lebanon is a refugee. Since 2019, the country is bankrupt and there has been no rescue plan. So we have a financial crisis, which of course means political disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and I can go on and on. Each of these crises, of course, brings flows of people, things, ideas, and capitals, which transform the city and its governance. In any case, the country has been without a president now for almost 2 years. The mayor has resigned, and the council meets only if there's a deal they can make money out of. It's common to explain transformations such as this. So this is sort of some of the fabric of Hamra. You can see the very modern high-rise buildings next to old heritage and abandoned site. These are the kinds of architectures that you can see, the kinds of inhabitances sometimes in the buildings that I'm talking about. So it's common to explain this type of urban transformation as the natural outcome of the multi-crisis that Lebanon is living. The crisis then elicits terms like abandonment, forced migration, or always ending with what these are, failed investments. However, terms such as these conceal the processes that generate the urban transformations that they claim to describe. And they obfuscate the forms of social reorganization that typically accompany these transformations. When a multi-story residential building that's inhabited precariously is described as a failed investment, the timeless logic of a city shaped by real estate development is normalized, and inhabitants is left as a side effect. Similarly, when a vacated building is described as abandoned, there's a whole set of assumptions about capital having left, people having decided to go because they had no more opportunities. When we refer to people as refugees, again, we bring attention to the failing role of international humanitarian organizations, and we invoke the modern nation state as protective of its citizens and tie the destitution of residents to their political status and the specific understanding of personhood and sovereignty that is generated, while we do not discuss what kind of housing, social, political context they are actually looking for shelter into. So these terms give some sense of common sense. They're widely used by journalists. They're also adopted by many scholars. And I think what they do is conceal the workings of the forces of racial, financial, exploitative, and neoliberal capital, and you can say more, that have been shown to be at work in other contexts. And they produce which have shown in other contexts to have produced abandonment and decay from what I'm showing here. So I'm thinking here very much of Detroit as one great example where such work has actually been conducted. In this presentation, I want to argue that the transformation of the urban landscape of Beirut into decay and ruins, which afford only precarious forms of urban inhabitants for the urban majorities, should be read in direct continuation with the historical and contemporary penetration of investment capital in Beirut's housing sector during the various moments of boom. I want to locate decay in the financialized city and not in the bankrupt city. And I want to show that it's then possible to see how decay is produced, the modalities in which it's inhabited, and the actors, institutions, logics, and ideologies that sustain its production as precarious shelter for the most vulnerable residents of today's Beirut. To do so, I'm going to bring 2 strands of research that I have worked on previously, but separately with researchers at the Beirut Urban Lab. The first is this notion of financialization. I will talk a little bit more about it, but since the end of the Lebanese Civil War in 1990, there's been a concerted effort by public agencies in Lebanon to encourage real estate flows into the country as a strategy to encourage economic development. Here we've mapped all the laws that have been passed. Of course, in the actually existing financialization in Beirut, there are much more informal processes, many informal actors, and we've been unpacking them, but that's for another presentation. The other strand of research is research on forced population displacement. Again, we've tried to contest the notion that refugees just come as aid recipients, and instead we've worked to show them as city makers. This book is available online. Studied separately, the unfolding of these crises is siloed in different fields of scholarship. So on the one hand, we study displacement under humanitarian, in a word of humanitarian studies, or refugee studies now, which is a growing field. And we study financialization in geography or economics. We also study shrinking cities separately. We also study them in different timelines. So the refugee crisis starts in Europe in 2015. It starts in Lebanon in 2011. Financialization starts before. It means that neither scholars nor policymakers account for the continuities and intersections that occur in the urban fabric. The way in which multiple flows, people, institutions, actors, and capital operate at several scales and intersect in the built environment, producing new territorial configurations or sociospatial assemblages, which in turn shape opportunities and foreclose others. So my interest in these tenement buildings is that they were once the pride of modern Beirut and are now either abandoned or inhabited by precarious populations, mostly Syrians, is driven by the way the multiple and overlapping crises of today's Middle East intersect and coalesce in these buildings. Because crises disrupt the existing social formations, they can no longer, it's impossible to reproduce the same systems and the same social relations that existed before. So moments of crisis are great in helping us see the labor and the violence that goes into reproducing and organizing social inequalities such as this, showing for whom opportunities are created or foreclosed. They provide us with an opportunity to understand better the type of labor that is worked. I think one of the main things that I will focus on today and that has become very visible is the work of property in producing these kinds of realities. Now, I want to emphasize that the urban transformations I am describing are occurring very much in the context of a receding nation state. The state, the collective, the notion of a we living in Lebanon, or even we Lebanese, is slowly disappearing. And as I explained in the beginning, one of the main outcomes of the overlapping crisis is that the municipality is no longer involved in state affairs. Really, very little. They don't collect the garbage. It's an informal system. Electricity from the state comes 0 to 3 hours a day when it comes. So people are using private generation when they can. Water from public networks comes once a week, and the list is going on. So when this operates, what is basically happening is an individuation of urban transformation at the scale of buildings or at the scale even of the individual apartment. And that makes the work of property and the fact that these transactions are happening at that level much more visible. Of course, the state effect is still there in many ways, and I would bring it up in many places, but it's important to understand that labor of property becomes so much more important in that context. And that's why I would like to center on the property regime that I will argue structures interactions among actors through its logics, its history, who owned before, the ideologies, the moral order, what is right, what is wrong, do you squat, do you not, and who has the right to do that, the rules, the legal judicial frameworks that can both formal and informal that organize the transaction, that organize it. And it turns urban transformation into transactions, partial transfer, exchange, but also rent. I allow you conditionally to come and stay here for a certain period of time. Okay, I should just collect my papers because it looks ridiculous. Sorry about that. So in sum, if we read the working of the propertied landscape, so And so refugees arrive in this context, and we should read the working of the property landscape on the refugee settlement, and more generally on the type of housing opportunities that are afforded in a financialized city. We find that property functions like a relational technology that largely explains access to specific neighborhoods, determines mobility, the distribution of housing options, inequality, displacement, segregation, poverty, eviction, discrimination, and exploitation. These relations, in turn, shape the transformations of the urban landscape and the changing opportunities they afford for certain social groups. So, of course, I am making these claims building on the fabulous work of many, many scholars working on property, but also on issues of rent and displacement, mostly in the United States for rent, actually, which is very interesting because because these frameworks you wouldn't think of them as operating in this context, but also beyond. I will not throw all the names, but I want to acknowledge that some of you are here. So with this in mind, let's go to Beirut. And I'm going to show here some of the map I'm showing here are part of the work that we've been doing at the Beirut Urban Lab. And I like to stop for a minute and talk about what it takes to produce research of this kind, or to be able to say what is happening. In many cities around the world, particularly in the South, there's been a deliberate effort of unknowing, of erasing, of unmapping. And by doing that, what has happened is that privatization is rampant, evictions are rampant, and when you try to denounce things, you're told we don't know. Nobody really knows. There is really no fact. And there's a lot of red tape, of course, so you can't access the data. So one of the things we've done at the Urban Lab is we've tried to create a base map for the city of Beirut, and that was work that we did with people in the public sector, students, archives, collecting all the data, producing a georeferenced map, and then securing a data set of building permits that then allowed us to survey and to be able to say something. Now, this becomes some kind of a commons, a data as commons, and it has actually allowed us to be able to produce a conversation around the city, but also to continue with actors in multiple places inside and I emphasize individuals inside the state, pieces of the state that do want to see a good urban transformation, or maybe not, but they have a relationship with us. And by building this relationship, we have been able to access archives that would have otherwise been impossible to access, but also to create conversations that would have been impossible to create. So the new technologies that are available these days are allowing us to create certain conversations, and clin d'œil to this morning's discussion, some comparisons that would have actually been fully impossible a few years ago. So this is, so between 2004 and 2013, and all this data is the outcome of that survey, more than 10% of Beirut's residential fabric was redeveloped. And you can see here, it starts in some neighborhoods, but eventually it develops to cover the entire city. In the mapping conducted by the Beirut Urban Lab, you could see that 10% of the city was developed in just 6 years, 14% in the post-Civil War era. In many ways, our findings confirm what others have described as the financialized city. New developments displaced people with higher towers and larger apartments, but also emptier homes. One in 4 apartments built in the post-Civil War period is empty, developed during the vacant at the time of the survey, and it seemed to be held as an investment. It wasn't furnished. This is what scholars like Fernandez and Albers, Raquel Rolnik, and others have described as the financialization of housing, the unlocking of land values in cities. But studying only new developments as the outcome of financialization, we are often blinded by these kinds of landscapes. In practice, however, when we started surveying, we also came across buildings where there was a new building permit, but this is what was on site. In many cases, people actually lived in these buildings. So they had no idea that there was a development that was coming. In total, 138, or about 7% of the total sample, was actually buildings that still stood there. The fact that one would live in a building, not knowing that it had been slated for demolition, geared our team's attention to how financialization is seeping into the fabric of Beirut seamlessly, generating multiple invisible disruptions that are yet to come. Consequently, we expanded the research more systematically, looking at what we described as cases of housing precarity. So we built this website and we started documenting cases across the city where we could find buildings that looked very deteriorated. So they were ruins. And often people said, oh, yes, this was left by the Civil War, but the Civil War has been over for 35 years. So something else is happening here. And we started trying to map their stories, what was happening to them. And that's the website, which you can visit, and it has tons of stories of buildings all over Beirut, each one with interviews with residents, archival work, to sort of explain why does decay happens. These buildings are stuck in the urban fabric, sometimes described as ruins of pre-war booms. They have been devalued by years of civil war, but especially in its aftermath. It is importantly the changing place of Beirut in the global economy, and consequently the changing position of these buildings in the city. They have gone from being primarily a place where one can live to being a place where one stocks their capital, and sometimes they are redeveloped in the infinite game of real estate capitalism, which is always, in Mike Davis's term, optimistic, right? Development will come. How do the tenement buildings fit in these cycles of capital? So in order to study the tenement buildings, we went in depth into one neighborhood, which is again the backyard of the American University of Beirut. So it seemed fitting to work where we live. And we mapped the entire neighborhood. We looked at the conditions of every building, and we were able to identify vacant buildings, and then those we call dilapidated buildings, whether they were inhabited or not. The 10 buildings that are inhabited, we studied them in depth. We looked at who lives in them, who owns them first, who lives in them, since when do they own them, what drives the deterioration, what are the conditions in which people live in these buildings. And this is what we found. So the majority, so these are the property holders in all of Hamra. I'm short on time. So 26%, 1 in 4 of the buildings that are vacant is held by someone we call an investor. So who are the investors? Well, they're basically individuals who don't live in the neighborhood. They don't have life plans or relationships to the neighborhood or even to the building. They may be absent for the country for decades. Some of them, particularly Arab investors, own these buildings before the Civil War and have not been back. The money that is used to purchase these buildings is typically made always outside Lebanon. And to them, the value of the building is a place to first park capital and maybe see it increased. There is a distinction, though, between the foreign Arab Gulf investors who own most of the buildings from before the Civil War, when they were built in order to be rented out, and the Lebanese investors. Now, you could say they are rich, they forgot the buildings. Why are you talking about property? But there are many incentives that are created around the idea that they should continue to own the property. And these are incentives that exist in the Lebanese public discourse and in the decisions of the Lebanese policymakers. These buildings have not paid taxes since the 1970s. No one has tried to seize them, to auction them, to ask the owners to implement the law the way they should be. And when we ask public decision makers, why do you not try to implement the law? Why don't you try to make them pay taxes or have them repair the buildings? The answer is you cannot scare away Arab investors. So there's this dream that the money is going to come back again. And so for the money to come back, we can't implement the law. And so you see that public decisions by Lebanese public decision makers are encouraging this. When we try to understand why these investors are not coming back, again, there's a whole set of issues that constrain them from coming back to Lebanon, because in the geopolitical standoff between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the Saudi government, the Arab Gulf countries have prevented their citizens from coming to Lebanon, that is considered an ally of Iran right now. So in that context, to pressure the country, the citizens can come back, and so the property stays. What I mean to say is that there is a level in which buildings such as the one I opened with the conversation are held by people who have not been there. In this case, it's a building that is held by a Jordanian, an Emirati, and their Lebanese lawyers, and they haven't been there since the 1970s. The vast majority of investors are, however, Lebanese investors. They're people who are making money in very exploitative way, mostly in Africa. If Abdul Malik was here, he would have told you a lot about it. Many of these are Muslim Shia. And again, in the geopolitical international game, since 2006, there's a lot of restrictions on flows of capital. So they can't send their money anymore to the Arab Gulf. They can't send it to Europe or to the US. No bank will take their money. So the only place they can place their money is in Lebanon. And since the banks are bankrupt since 2019, they have to park their money in real estate. So some of these buildings continue to be flush with cash as they look this way, precisely because they are being used for something other than inhabitation due to the circumstances. But that's not the whole picture. You also have another kind of rearrangement that is happening between people who used to own buildings in the neighborhood. And the vast majority of property owners are what we're calling the families. So the families are basically the bourgeois Lebanese class of the 50s. They were mostly traders. They moved out of the historic core into this happening neighborhood, typically build one building, open the store, and they could rent some apartments and live well, teach their kids at the American university. And they were slowly becoming the middle class. The Civil War begins to destroy the wealth of most of them. And the aftermath of the Civil War and financialization places them in a very difficult situation, particularly because they're the only ones who still have people on the so-called rent control, which is a distorted, weird system that it would take me 5 hours to describe, but that basically they're bearing the brunt of something that, I mean, I would never be seen saying rent control should not exist, but it's very weird the way it's working on them. It's not weird, it's more complicated. We classified families into two groups. Some of them, very few, we're calling them the accumulating families, following Forrest and Hirayama. And these are families that are able to play the real estate game. So they've managed somehow to consolidate ownership, to partner with a developer, and to stay on. The majority, however, are basically not financially literate. They're unable to take advantage of banking facilities, and they are inheriting the building over several generations with rent control, so they're getting impoverished. And what they're doing now is they're resisting. They're trying to stay in the neighborhood, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to do those. Many also, unlike the investors, felt obligated, like I have an old woman who's been living in the building for a long time, I won't evict her, this is a family, we can't do that. So they were less transactional. At the same time, they viewed the building as the only way in which they could maintain a minimum lifestyle, or often they had to sell something, an apartment or a unit, in order to be able to treat someone who's been ill, etc. Finally, one thing about these buildings, many have a lot of property conflicts around them, and some of them have basically clearly contested ownership. And so this is the case, for example, of the building that I introduced in the beginning. While it's held by foreign investors, in practice, there's been a lot of weird transactions around the building. And one of the most interesting happens in the early 1990s when a Lebanese general comes to the neighborhood and says that he's been delegated by the owners to evict the people who had squatted the building during the Civil War. So the general basically forges, makes paper, I'm not really sure, maybe he really pays some of the property owners. Suffice it to say that he identifies himself in the local neighborhood as the owner, manages through his political connections to evict all the tenants, and decides to close off the building and to hire someone who will actually be in charge of the building. And the building is managed now by a Syrian refugee for the last 15 years. And this individual basically thinks that the owner is the Lebanese general. And through that fiction of the fact that he is the owner, then a new market can be developed on the invitation of the Syrian refugee who says, why don't we rent these apartments? Why are they closed? So, yeah, so I'm getting ahead of myself, but just to say that basically, in sum, if we look first at that first level of how decay is produced through the ownership of these buildings, we find that decay is not happening because it's a failed investment and capital has flown out. Actually, it is accelerated by the flow of capital, because when investors purchase buildings, they're basically trying to get them to decay so that they can do with them what they want. They don't care about them. And anytime you see an investor purchasing a building, very rapidly it decays. The other thing that we should, that is important to retain is the fact that around property, people are negotiating their ability to stay in the neighborhood, at least among the old property owners. How do these buildings become inhabited? A second form of property transaction that occurs is around tenancy. So tenancy in this context is, of course, when a property owner allows under conditional circumstances someone to stay in that apartment in exchange of a payment. Here I'm very much quoting Nick Blomley. In this context, refugees who are anyway not afforded any protection, neither in their countries nor in Lebanon, are renamed as tenants. They enter the city through the framework of a landlord-tenant relation that gears us to ask very different questions about refugee settlement than when we think of them as humanitarian aid. And so rather than asking what kind of aid do these families live, what are their minimum needs, what do they lack, at what point, I think it's more important, it's much more, it elucidates much more about urban transformation and the urbanization of forced population displacement to ask, how are these refugees penetrating that housing? Who are they displacing, if at all? Under what conditions are they allowed to access shelter? And what kind of protections can they be afforded? The second question to ask is what happens to the neighborhood when these kinds of urban developments occur? Who makes that decision? When this building has refugees from top to bottom or workers from top to bottom, it's going to affect the entire neighborhood. And we're seeing this only as the decision makers are only the gatekeepers, the landlords. So just to give you some sense of the kind of inhabitations more, this is the survey of all 10 tenements, and you can see the profile of the residents. There's mostly families. A few apartments have single women, and the rest are shared men, etc. These are the conditions across the buildings. Almost all the residents are Syrian refugees. All working tenants report holding low-wage jobs, such as construction work or services, and many also work as delivery drivers. Many tenants report they had to work day and night shifts to afford the rent and meet their family's basic needs. They also rely on aid money, but very little, and on remittances by relatives who manage to go to better places. Severe overcrowding is one of the main aspects of their everyday life. Several apartments accommodate 2 or more families to share the rent. So this practice is recorded in many buildings because they are afraid not to be able to be paying rent, and so they're evicted. So sometimes several families will share a 1-bedroom apartment. Of course, this increases tenancy and the number of residents, and when it increases this, it creates nuisances and it creates tensions with the neighbors. So it creates the stereotypes and it fuels that discriminatory discourse that's anyway pushed by the Lebanese political decision makers. None of the tenants holds a formal written contract. Instead, a broker is usually delegated by the owner to manage the building. And he will eventually, if he's Lebanese, if that broker is Lebanese, he will hire a Syrian individual who will start renting out the apartment. This leaves the tenants in a state of uncertainty regarding future possible rent increases. So when we interviewed residents in these buildings, as the currency was changing, 80% of them had seen their rent change in the last 3 to 4 months. Even worse, they don't know how long they will be there. One of the things that marked me the most is one individual who said he had been in a building for 20 years, could not say for sure that he could stay in that apartment for the next 2 months. The gatekeeper is responsible for collecting the rent. He acts as the main enforcer and the liaison with the building wakil or custodian, except for the buildings held by families where people live together. He collects monthly subscriptions from tenants to cover the costs of the shared services. And I can go more on this, but I think what is important to point is that in reality, it's evident that refugees seek shelter in cities where housing has been financialized alongside or in competition with other precarious social groups, in cities that are sometimes bankrupt and at other times subjected to austerity measures. Conversely, the arrival of large flows of refugees is bound to disrupt and change the neighborhoods and cities where they settle. So within this capitalist logic, we really need to understand the refugees as another way in which value is extracted through accumulation and a potential source of revenue for the landlords, and not as aid recipients. For investors, they are also a great way to evict Lebanese tenants. So it's not just a relationship between the landlord and the refugees. We also see that many of the investors will bring in refugees when they want to, because that's a great way to evict the people who are on old rent control. And that creates a lot of tensions between the two. For impoverished families, they represent, conversely, a way in which they may be able to retain their property. So when they get the refugees in, they could get some income, and maybe they will be able to hold on to their property. In all, residency is premised on the ability to pay the rent. That is the way in which the refugees become deserving refugees, because they are earning their incomes and they are paying the rent. It is also the way in which morally it's accepted for them to be in these neighborhoods. The aid apparatus, all the aid, the financial flows that can come to support the refugees, they become a way to maintain the fiction, because the refugees can pay the rent, so the transaction is held and the market survives. And so what happens if we study? So what happens if we study refugees as tenants? Neither is the city context, which is how it's often dealt with, nor is there a uniform landscape of tenants, all accessing housing through a clear framework of exchange. Rather, the presence of refugees disrupts and expands the landscape of informal and precarious rent, and expands the opportunities for extracting capital from existing buildings, particularly decayed buildings, transforming in-turn neighborhoods where these investments are happening. In this sense, I think it's really important that we go back to what we're calling right now in the urban literature, the urbanization of refugee studies. This is a growing field, and we see a lot of conversations happening around it. In Europe, I was able to find 3 or 4 recent texts where scholars have started to intersect the idea of forced population displacement arriving into cities under days of austerity and neoliberal transformation. The reason why this discussion is happening is from the entry point of governance, because municipalities are the primary authorities that have to deal with refugees. And so given what neoliberalism has done to local authorities, and the fact that the weight of serving these communities is falling on typically small and medium-scale municipalities that have suffered austerity, there is an interesting conversation about the capabilities that these institutions have in order to be able to govern displacement. In the global South, we're not seeing this kind of conversation yet. At least I haven't found it. But there is, and here's a shout out to Faranak Miraftab and Hoek's paper on comparing informal settlements and refugees. Because in that case, what they did is they flipped what many of us were doing. Many of us were saying the camps are like informal settlements. They've settled in the cities for a very long time. And a lot of the work that I did early on the urbanization of displacement was about demonstrating the extent to which camps function within the city and not outside it. But what they did is they told us, and who tells you that people in informal settlements have the protection of a modern nation state, or that they actually are citizens or have better entitlements? So in that case, and I'm told I'm almost out of time, in that case, it forces us to basically relocate these groups in relation to each other and understand that refugees should be read in relation to other precarious groups in the city. It doesn't mean that the status of refugee doesn't matter at all. Of course, they are more vulnerable. We see them being evicted more often. The numbers, comparing them to other social groups in the city, are also devastating. They do show that they are in worse conditions. But okay, so since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to just skip to the last point I wanted to make, which is I've already discussed the way in which property serves as a framework of exchange and transforms the grounds of the city and who holds it and who decides on it. I've also argued for thinking of refugees as tenants through the framework of interactions around the institutions of property. The last point I want to make is the way in which property also limits the imaginary of the future of what the city can become. This is clearly the case among the refugees and their relationships with the people who rent them. The refugees don't imagine that they can live in the cities outside the framework of rent. When we ask them what else can happen, why are you renting? They couldn't find another way in which they imagined a commons or the possibilities of someone supporting them. Of course, it's a full failure of the international humanitarian organizations, but that's not enough. Even the property owners, in seeing how this housing has happened, in most interviews, we found that it was actually a Syrian refugee who went to an investor or the representative of an investor and told them, hey, how about we rent these units? And they act as brokers and they open spaces and they re-expand the spaces of transaction through their presence. Even more ironic is the fact that even in the fiction of what will become later, when we were discussing these issues, particularly with the brokers, the people who hold these buildings, they would consistently say, oh, it will be demolished. Just to give you an example, the Abu Firas, the guy who manages this building, before closing the conversation, the interviewer asked him, how do you imagine the future of this building? Do you think it can be fixed? And he answered, despite his role, Abu Firas said that this building is unworthy of maintenance. And he said it will be demolished once the real estate boom again in the city. He doesn't own the building, doesn't claim to hold it, doesn't claim to actually profit from its future. And yet he imagines that the real estate will be back. I have attempted through this lecture to present some of the ways in which population displacement intersects with earlier and current cycles of boom and bust. And I've argued that this intersection is largely structured and mediated by property frameworks that are both formal and informal. And that organize and define the opportunities for both profit and inhabitants, but also infuse huge power into specific individuals who are able to determine the becoming not only of their buildings, but also of the neighborhoods. The fiction that the property landscape generates, a fiction of a market, of ownership, enables and perpetuates the reproduction of these unequal relations, and in turn, the extractive relations around precarious housing. By bringing these strands of study together, I hope to articulate a more coherent and complex understanding of the deployment of financial capital in today's cities, one that accounts for how events unfold in place and over time, and look at its implication for people who inhabit the financialized city and how this inhabitance transforms in periods of crisis. Beyond bringing another case study from yet one more city about how capital is devastating the urban, the hope is for the research to help challenge the hegemony of finance on urban development and property as the framework through which we read the city, by contributing first to a better framework of how it treats, but also daring to imagine, like Sarah Safransky recently wrote, that there can be a city after property. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona, for this wonderful lecture and for showing us a different reality that many of us are very unfamiliar with. So thank you. So now we will hear from Catalina Ortiz, a few words.
Literally few words. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think when Javier told me to comment on Mona's work, I was like, are you sure you want me to be commenting. Because I'm not a property scholar, I'm not an expert in refugee research. I don't work around financialization of housing. So why am I even sitting here? And yet, I think we need to put in context what Mona has proposed to us. And I think Mona's work has been absolutely crucial for many of us sitting here. And I think Mona has taught us how to think with Beirut about our own context. And I think Mona's work has been illuminating in help us to understand contexts like the Colombian one. You know, when you, in your work, has proposed to think, what is the role of armed actors in planning and transforming the city? Nobody from the global north could actually propose that. And finding, you know, the signaling the path of thinking differently, how to engage in the city, you know, it has been exemplary. And I think your work around borders in the city and how you engage with the militarization of cities has been very important. And in a way, even though you don't mention it here, is completely, totally ingrained. So I think something beautiful about Mona's work is that has like this thickness and texture and the sedimentation of all this thinking across time. So I really, you know, enjoy the visual aspect of it, because she's thinking with the materiality, but teaching us how to engage in very deep understanding and the theoretical propositions that help us question kind of those truths taken for granted in urban studies. So I think, you know, the type of scholarship that we are seeing in Mona's work and in the urban lab that she directs is making us think about other ways of producing urban research. You know, a research that is committed, that is working despite the conditions, but also producing this rich visualization of data in not only places that are data scarce, scarcity, but also all kind of the political tensions and, you know, like the opacity and all the games that are behind that. So I think just, you know, the maps that we were looking at is a testament of really working with partners and making collaborations and making this a collective work. And I think that, you know, for people like me that work around collaboration, you cannot take it for granted. And it requires a very type of sensibility and ethos that we all should be learning from. So, you know, when I grow up, I want to be like you. But I think also some of the work that you are showing is very important in posing, you know, very deep questions to all of us. On the one hand, how do we even think in terms of what can be done? You know, what is the role of planning? And how can planning help us think in that world after property? On the other hand, can we even think about justice in contexts that are prone to multi-crisis? What crises help us to understand around how we do even urban research? What are the limits even of research practices? To what extent we understand, you know, if we see the city through the lenses of mobility and forced displacement, what are the entanglements with spatial violence, but also the colonial regimes that are entangled? And most importantly, I think when I was reading the piece and the title in itself, it reminded me to understand ruins as a violent verb and ruination as a project of destruction, excavation of value, but also neglect, and how, in a way, this also show us different reverberations of colonial violence. And in this moment in time, you know, how can we even think urban studies when we need to make ruins as part and parcel of how we think the urban, when herbicide, ecocide, and genocide coexist? How can we think with the ruins, and how can then foresee different alternative futures from it, right? And how can even we excavate hope in the middle of all this despair that sometimes we fear and hear and feel? And I think, you know, the work that you do is very inspiring, but at the same time, it's posing questions for us in terms of how we as scholars need to reshape as well the research agenda, and how, learning from and thinking with Beirut is putting us in a different perspective and also allowing us to enter from a little window and understand that kind of urban sensibilities that the work we are doing is, helping us to navigate and perhaps shape other ways of doing urban research. So thank you so much for your work.
So now we will start taking questions. I really would like to ask that people who want to ask questions to be very brief and to only ask questions, not to make very long comments, if that's possible. I also would like to ask si la gente que quiera preguntar en español, en castellano, podemos perfectamente traducirlo porque es importante también que participen. Thank you. So, who would like to ask to Mona anything? So, one, two, so far? Only two?
Hi. Well, thank you so much for your lecture, Mona. I was really glad to hear. I already talked to you about my research, so I'm really interested. I read the book of Professor Hiba Bouakar, and she says a lot about how urban planning in Beirut is always with the thinking of the war yet to come. And I was thinking during your presentation how this process of financialization relates to this thinking of the war yet to come and to armed groups as urban planning and this kind of work that you already did. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating paper. I do research in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, and this kind of focus on ruins as a kind of outcome of this very much outsourced forms of financialization, and then absence, opacity of what the municipality even is in that context is really interesting. I'm sorry, that was just a little bit of a comment. But what I wanted to ask you is I was really taken at the end when you talked about the future or perceptions of temporality more generally. And I was wondering if you would like to just expand further, because I was so fascinated about how people living in these buildings situate themselves temporally, especially in terms of the fact that there seems to be these sites of speculation amongst networks in refugees living in these buildings. And I was really taken with the example that you had of the refugee that was brokering with the broker. I thought that was really fascinating. And also how living in these buildings, how the act of dwelling in that kind of McFarlane idea of dwelling as some process that's shaping the urban, how that influences whether or not people can stay there longer, or whether developments that, I mean, this is where this idea of this building, that it's going to become something that's going to be redeveloped, whether that process of dwelling affects that. So this is not to romanticize processes of dwelling, and it's certainly not to romanticize this kind of networks, but I do look at these buildings and see so many people and see that as a site of something really generative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. That was moving and wonderful and brilliant. Thank you very, very much. I wanted to just ask you to say a bit more about what you said about the fading away of the nation state and what that does to the kind of arguments you're making in the lab, and almost in a sense who you're directing them to, because in some ways we're always directing them in that direction. And if it's not to that, then what structures can hold a disruption of this hegemony of property? And just to say a bit more about that moment of fading. Thank you.
Shukran, Mona. يعطيك العافية. I wanted to ask, actually, in the context of futures, what people who live in these buildings want. What is the future that they envision for their, habitation, both in relation to property and just in relation to the city? Yeah, thank you so much for it. It was amazing.
My question has already been asked about.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the questions. I thank you, Catalina, for the very generous comments. I'm a big fan of your work, and I've been thinking with it for years now. So thank you. Maybe I want to dwell a little bit on that question of planning and link Hiba Bouakar's word to come with the absence of the state and Catalina's question. There's been a lot of work in the field of planning on how bad planning is, how it's destroyed cities, how negative, how sectarian it is, how it's reproduced social inequality, how it's erased neighborhoods. And of course, it's done all of that and maybe more. However, there's something about planning that I think is magic. It's that it upholds the notion of a collective and the possibility that people who share a same space can have a shared imaginary of a future and work together to improve it. That principle of planning is so important because it basically holds that notion of the collective. At a time where, with neoliberalism, with everything that is being fought against the collective in our cities, there's a huge process of individuation. I also realize that the state is often a bad actor. But I have news for those who have been particularly colleagues who are detached from contexts where the state is disintegrating. It's catastrophic when the state is not. We don't have a better recipe. I wish we did. We don't. Right now, we really, really don't. And informality does not produce a more just, necessarily at least, does not produce a more just outcome than the state. And I've shown you right here. I tell friends in the US that when I stop being a scholar, I'm going to organize travel tours for American Republicans in Lebanon. Those of you who know the context will understand. It's La La Land. It's superb. There's no state. Everyone has weapons. You can do whatever you want. Try it for 2 days. So with this in mind, what do you do with information like this? You basically try to see how you can create a collective. And I think planning has a recipe to be able to start thinking about collectives. So one strategy in here is to learn from groups who are already doing that. And there are groups who are already doing that at the scale of neighborhoods, within their buildings, etc. But there's also the work of those of us who have a responsibility because we are in research centers, because we are in universities, because we have that privilege. And the data set was that effort to then see who can we connect to who and how. And we've made ourselves useful to humanitarian organizations, to some actors in public agencies, and less so to some of the private sector, a lot to activists. And one of the things I decided very early on as a scholar is I only work on topics where activists are ahead of me and are advocating. So my work can be taken somewhere that is useful because no one will ever buy my public policy on my own. I mean, let's get real. Giving a policy report to a public actor may be difficult in France. It's impossible in Lebanon. It's not even in the realm of possibilities. So what we do is we try to create projects around which a sense of a collective and a we is created. Around these buildings specifically, we have managed at the lab to convince one of the international organizations that pays cash for rent to instead put the money towards fixing a building that we could make into a mixed income building, and to talk to one of the owners to be able to rehabilitate the building and create a mixed income over a short period of time. It's not a long-term hope, but we're trying to now build the alliance between the actors to push for that and create some kind of a proof of concept. It's one case, it's very limited. It doesn't erase property, but I think it gestures towards one possible outcome. We also still do a lot of activism. I mean, so we have a legal proposal to fight vacant housing in Beirut. We push it, we give it to parliamentarians. It's at the discursive level, it works to help create a different imaginary. it stops there. It's not going to change the law. But of course, I don't say this when I talk there. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. So that's for planning. Sorry, this is very long. I'm going to try to be faster and say that, yes, I'm always on the issue of ruins. I think it's really important to recognize the way in which financial capital is at least as destructive as war. I mean, we had 15 years of civil war, and we have 35 years of major impoverishment to the population, which compounded effects of the circuits of capital in the city are worse on people's everyday life in many ways than the war, particularly in impoverishment. So we are turning the city into ruins. And what is also important to know is that, and I said that quickly in the presentation, once an investor purchases a building, he's going to do everything so it deteriorates so that he can then destroy it when he wants, evict resident when he wants. That's why the conditions of livelihood in these buildings are much worse than the rest. So if you go to even camps, makeshift camps, and houses in more peripheral areas, you find that the homes are more homes, that people have more projects of creating the possibilities of home. Precarity is so high here that we're not seeing people able to really create that sense of home, the furniture, the everyday normalcy. Kids are no longer going to school. This is an extreme case, and it is extreme because of the inequality in the neighborhood, the proximity of these with right next to them, something that really doesn't resemble them. It's a high-end tower that has now fenced itself, and where people try to go in and out of their homes in an SUV so they don't have to deal with this. So finally, yeah, so maybe we talked a little bit about the fading nation state. I think I've answered more or less the questions. I hope so. We haven't talked enough to the residents to ask them what they imagine, frankly. This is the next project, so we're on it.
Do we have more questions? Yes, okay. Any more down here? Okay, so let's come here. I'll go with a microphone in 1 minute.
Hi, my name is Malin Bey. I'm a PhD student at Cornell University, and I want to take advantage of the moment of having Mona and Catalina in the same table to ask a question about trauma and healing. And so, you know, all of these layers of crisis that Catalina was mentioning, it creates very deep embodied trauma and health inequity. So I was wondering if in your work, you have reflected about how the precarity of the home and these issues of property, right, are enabling layers of trauma, right, on the residents. If perhaps in your future projects, you can ask the residents about it.
Well, I think the concept of geotrauma that Rachel Payne proposes is very powerful to understand kind of the spatiality of trauma on the one hand. And I've been working through this idea of territorial healing to understand the multiple layers and even proposal in terms of how we go about it. So I've been thinking methodologically how to address that. And for doing that, I've been working with psychologists. I mean, I'm an architect, so what would I know? But I think we've been thinking together in how you cannot even do research in places that been, you know, and communities that been subjected to so many traumas, just like pretending as nothing has happened. So part of the collaborative work that I have done had led me to actually understand that you cannot just go as business as usual with your hat of academic, but you really need to change completely the methodology, the ethos. And I've been learning and bringing on board people with indigenous knowledges and the rituals that communities and activists that are been working with victims of conflict and forced displaced communities are making part of the everyday life and rituals to gather and to always put in the center kind of the resacralization of life and working with survivors of conflict. So I've been thinking in, and learning a lot from the communitarian, feminist, and indigenous communities, ideas of territorio, cuerpo, tierra, and how you engage also with kind of the body first, and how we need to learn more about the spiritual dimension of working with communities, and also deal with our own trauma. I was avoiding dealing with issues of violence or conflict for 20 plus years, but then I ended up just kind of going back because you cannot escape from it. And just being a Colombian it's something I don't want to talk about it because it's been so painful, that you also have to acknowledge your own trauma and your own inabilities and the scars that this produces in you as a researcher. So I will leave it there.
I don't think I have much to add, honestly, on trauma, but I think that the point you make about the difficulty of creating a conversation. When I walk in a building like this, I'm seen as Lebanese. I visibly live better. If I say I'm from the American University, it's a disaster. One of the things that we've learned to do is that it's actually really a research team of people who are very different. And because we are very different, we can hold different conversations. And that sort of reduces what Bourdieu called the space of difference between two interlocutors. And then a lot of this is bridged in the lab in our conversations, so we can actually understand those life words. But I'm not an anthropologist. I've been looking for an anthropologist to come and work with us who would be trained in thinking about these issues. I also don't want to be presumptuous, but there is a massive burden on these individuals when they have to answer some of the questions. So you're also super careful. On the other hand, they're not really over researched. They're not sick of us. So they're actually keen on being seen. So that part is it's been easier.
Thank you, Hannah Hilbrand from the University of Zurich. I'll keep thinking about this talk for quite some while. It's really been inspiring. And I have a question about your relationship, the relationship between property and the nation state in this context where you just described the nation state as fading. So when we typically think that the property rights or property is guaranteed by the nation state, who in this context then guarantees or stabilizes property, and how do we have to rethink our conceptualization of what property is actually about?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I did my dissertation in the largest informal settlement of Beirut, that's very far from here, and in that around that neighborhood, everything was squatted. In that neighborhood, there was not a single squat, and I thought it was very interesting. So there was a lot of land transactions, but they were all illegal. But the property was legal, so people bought the property and then subdivided it illegally and built illegally. And I wanted to know what can hold property in this area when it cannot exist elsewhere. And what I found out is that there was a group of men who wanted to keep buying and selling land. So they joined the local militia and protected the land and sold it to people who were afraid to squat or didn't have protection from the militias to squat. And so hence they were able to create a market. So when the state is not playing that role, other actors emerge. Right now in Lebanon, like I said, the state has not fully receded. Its effects, both in regulations and in the moral order of how people think about things, is still very much present. And you still can't pay a policeman to come and evict if someone occupies illegally. How long it will hold, I'm not sure the trajectory the country is going on. But for now, you can see that these buildings don't have squats. They are rented. They are rented sometimes by someone who's very powerful, so he's able to take hold of the building and claim ownership. But when he claims ownership in the framework of the state. So the state is maintained as the ultimate authority that still protects the property order. It doesn't protect you as a citizen, but it protects property.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. I just want to ask something about family, because one thing that came through, I mean, you mentioned it obviously in terms of the holdings, but also in this discussion of the individual and the collective and these other forms of collective, the public and sex and other things being corrosive or eroded, the family is back. And I'm thinking also of Hannah Sender's work with you on small towns and the roles of family. Family is also something obviously where ideas and anxieties about property are passed down. So even though you haven't probably done research on this, what ideas about property, what it's for, are being passed down to the next generation, and what might be some of the implications of that?
Yeah, should I answer? That's very important. Definitely, family is one of the institutions through that is allowing the survival, actually, of refugees and of impoverished Lebanese families. There are solidarities at the scale of the family, increasingly the nucleus family, but sometimes the extended family as well. I think that Hannah's done great work about that outside Beirut. Because I'm so interested in property, I have been really essentially looking at the families as the property holders and less at the networks of solidarity among refugees, honestly. So I won't claim that I know enough how they're helping each other, but I can tell you that that the families of Ras Beirut that are being impoverished because the property is being redistributed among more inheritors. And there are a lot of negotiations, a lot of conflicts within the families. And you see that sometimes there are more individual strategies actually to retain some holding than strategies at the scale of the family and the imagination that existed in the generations before. That's more the case in the families that manage to invest, when one person usually gets the capital and buys out everyone else, than in the dissipating families where there's still a lot of solidarity between them because they're trying collectively to retain a place in the city.
Hi, Mona. Thanks a lot for the wonderful presentation, and thanks a lot also for the opportunity of being in Beirut in March. So I'm connecting the two things, and also your previous answer, because while walking in Beirut in March, I passed by one of these buildings, and it was the only place in Beirut that I saw people armed with guns. The two guards, clearly a kind of Rio de Janeiro situation of two guys in front of the building with machine guns chatting. Actually, they were completely relaxed because there was no enemy, but they were there because someone told them to be there. So it was probably some kind of armed group. So I wonder what's the connection of it? Has to do with the family also. What are the structures, the social structures that structure these places, and if armed groups are also behind this kind of thing?
Yes, I have to say that these kinds of arms that you saw are more normalized and you say anodin in French. Mundane, yes, thank you. Mundane, they're more mundane, you know, and not really. I mean, I haven't used them in the specific. I haven't seen them in the specific protection of these buildings. I've seen them in the protection of individuals, in claiming neighborhoods. That doesn't mean that former armed groups who are again displaying weapons that supposedly disappeared during the civil war are not re-entering very powerfully the governance of the city. Hamra is divided in 4 quarters that are held, 3 quarters that are held each by a former militia and reports to a different group. They are providing indirectly the right to provide services. The right to control a street. So like the informal generation providers are connected. Most of them are connected to a political / militia. And we're seeing them play more of a territorial role in the city. So I recently started reading a lot about organized crime groups in Latin America and their role in the city. And I'm taker of any references people have to say, because I was kicked out trying to do a project in one of Beirut's neighborhoods with the lab by one of these groups. And they forced the municipality to take away the permit they had given us, and they kicked us out of the area. So I realized that there is something that we were not thinking about. And I realized there's a fantastic scholarship in Latin America about these groups. So I've been reading about that, and I think it's extremely interesting to put them together. But I don't have enough right now to tell you how it relates, but it definitely plays a role.
Thank you, Mona. Any final questions for Mona? Yes, okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not articulate, so I'm just reflecting on hearing you, which was very moving. And maybe I misunderstand, but I hope you correct me. So it was very important for me to hear you saying, during the war, this is what happened, but real estate capital or capitalism was worse than war on what has done to Beirut. So then, I don't know, my mind just goes over Gaza. And if this is what capitalism is, seeing the potential of a real estate capital. So by ignoring, by allowing it to be destroyed, what is the potential of the real estate? And then in Gaza, by actual war, they are seeing the potential. I saw in one of the presentations, I think you were there too, already they are sketching the real estate that will grow. So maybe I wanted to, I don't know, my brain doesn't get me, but I see there are connections there, but I would appreciate.
In 1975, the destruction of the first, 1976, of the first informal settlement / slum in Beirut was justified by one of the political figures who was standing there, a posh young man. We are removing the poor and we are redeveloping the neighborhood. And today there's a lot of conversations by international consulting groups on how to rebuild Gaza. I think this is a very good point to actually raise. Definitely there is interest in benefiting, in profiting from, in a very predatory way from the imaginary of possible futures. And as of February, I began to receive requests as a planner, because I've worked on post-war reconstruction in Beirut many times. What would you do? Can you inform? And usually it's international organizations or it's international consulting groups who actually want to begin to develop that. My answer has been, and maybe it's a fitting way to close, that I will only imagine a post-Zionist future. So if you're willing to work with me for an inclusive future where everyone can live together as equal citizens, let's imagine the first step is to remove the wall and not rebuild a concentration camp. But if we are going to, as planners, rebuild a concentration camp and profit from it with real estate development, that's going to be catastrophic. And so maybe it's a good way to close on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mona, for this inspiring presentation. I'm sure everyone now wants to go and visit and know more about Beirut. So before you go for lunch, we have some messages from the organizing committee. Thank you, Maria Luisa.
Thank you, Sonia. Gracias. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mona. Well, thank you so much. Please don't leave. We have a few other things to say at the end, but before then, can please the local organizing team come to the front, please. Well, thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Thank you so much for coming all the way from different parts of the world to Santiago. This has been an amazing moment, 3 days, very intense, very emotional, very intellectually challenging. So thank you so much. We'll see each other in Vienna, no Vienna, no? Well, Rabat, Vienna, well, we'll see each other soon, right? And well, for those of you that registered for the field trips, they are departing from Carlos Casanueva, which is the street just next to the campus, right? And that's at about 2 o'clock and 2:30. But you have to be, for those of you that are going to the Museum of Memory and Human Rights, you have to be there 10 to 2, right? And for those that are going to the social, al revés, no? Okay. The one from the memory, and that's at what time?
Yeah, so we are meeting at 2:20 p.m. Outside the refectory, which is the registration room. And then at 2:30, we're heading to the bus.
So 10 to 2 for the other one, the one that Javier is organizing for the social inequalities in Santiago, right? The same place, Carlos Casanueva. Okay, en la calle, at the street, just on the side of the campus, right? The name is Carlos Casanueva. And for the memory, the Museum of Memory at
2:20 outside the refectory or the registration room, 2:20.
And for the other one, 10 to 2, right? Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is that for those that have registered for the party, we are meeting at 7:30 here at the entrance, the main entrance. And we are going to have the best time, right? That's for sure. Okay, and we are having pictures and we are going, it's 7:30, right? So that's it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.